Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. I'm so glad you're here. So last week we made the frame for a storage ottoman out of cardboard. And this week we're going to upholster this frame and make the top and upholster the top. I'm really excited about this project, so let's get started. So I do plan to upholster this with those Dollar Tree floor mats, which I absolutely love. But before I can do that, I need to put something on the bottom and something on the inside. And I'm running low on muslin, which is what I probably would have used normally. So what I ended up using was a canvas drop cloth. Now I've had this drop cloth for I think 3 years, and I have gotten a ton of use out of it because it's huge. So what I'm going to do first is cut a piece that is the size of the bottom plus a couple of extra inches around each edge. And I'm going to cut that out, iron it nice and flat, and then I'm going to lay it over the bottom again so that I have a couple of extra inches overhanging each edge. And then I'm going to cut little X's where I've drilled the holes for the ottoman feet. Now with that done, I'm going to glue it down to the ottoman with hot glue. And I will say that the hot glue actually holds both this and the rugs onto the cardboard very well. So I'm just going to glue it on one side and then do the other side. So pull it very tight, glue the other side down. So do opposite sides. Then I'm going to do the remaining two sides. And then I'm going to just fold the corners over as triangles. So fold them both into two sides with hot glue. Now you don't want this to be bulky. So I ended up afterwards cutting some of the bulk out of these triangles. For example, where there's a hem, that ended up being quite bulky, so I did cut some of that bulk out. And then once those were all hot glued in place, I just put a staple in each corner where those flaps are folded over to give it a little mechanical means to hold together. So with the bottom now upholstered, I am going to screw the ottoman feet in. They actually make it really easy for me to slide the ottoman around while I'm working on it. Now I need to upholster the inside. So the first thing I did was cut a piece of fabric to fit on the inside bottom. And again, iron that nice and flat. And I glued that down to the bottom around the edges. And then glued it up the side. And so where I have those little sort of shelves where I have the 7-inch triangles, but then just the 5.5-inch pillar, I just folded over the edges so that I could glue it neatly onto those shelves. I will say I'm doing a lot more gluing with fabric than I normally like to do. I had considered sewing the whole inside of this, but I think the gluing is much easier. Now, to go around the inside of the ottoman, whatever length or width I have of this drop cloth is enough to go all the way around the inside. So what I did then was I just folded it up so it was a manageable size and draped it over the side of the ottoman and made sure that I had some overlap at the bottom because I'm going to want a hem there and I'm going to want enough space to sort of glue it to the bottom. And then I went past where the triangles are and I cut the fabric. Now, the next thing I did, I probably did it in reverse order, but the first thing I did was just hem the cut edge of this because the other edge already has a hem sewn into it. The drop cloth comes with a hem, which can be handy or it can be annoying depending on what you're trying to do. And I just did a hot glue hem. Honestly, this is because I'm working where I usually have my sewing machine. So I wanted to do as much as I could before I brought the table back and started sewing. So normally I would stitch this, but I just hot glued a hem at the bottom and then I ironed the whole piece. Probably should have done it in the opposite order, but it wasn't a big deal. Now to put this into the ottoman, I did fold up a further hem. And what I did was I glued it to the sides of the ottoman wall on the inside, just a little piece at a time. So starting at one of the triangles, folded up that hem and glued it to the triangle wall and glued it to itself against the triangle wall. That's just because I folded a hem up like a second hem. I just wanted it to be neat at the ends. And I just pulled it tight and worked all the way around the inside of the ottoman. So then I would do one of those little 3-inch pieces between the triangles, and then I did the next triangle and just pulling it tight. So basically if we pull it straight up, it's perfectly straight. The walls are perfectly straight. And I went all the way around and it turned out that my drop cloth was longer than it needed to be. So where it overlaps, I just cut down the drop cloth and folded over another hem and glued that. So now I have a piece that completely covers the inside of the ottoman and is perfectly straight if I pull it straight up, but I need it to go over the sides of the ottoman, over the edge. So what I did was I cut straight down to the cardboard at the corners of each of the triangles. And then I pulled those flaps over, so at the 3-inch area where it's straight, I just pulled those over and glued them to the outside of the ottoman, nice and tight, and then trimmed off the excess. And then I'm left with the 4 triangles. For the triangles, I just folded the edges in, so I had a triangular shaped piece of fabric and glued that down. So now the entire inside of the ottoman is upholstered with the drop cloth. So the inside looks pretty good. Where the seam is, it doesn't look great, but I think it's okay. Now it's time to do the outside of the ottoman. And I'm very excited about this. I have these Dollar Tree mats that I'm going to use. And I actually went to 7 different Dollar Trees to find these because they don't make this pattern any longer. They do have a $5 mat, which is much larger, which is a similar pattern. And of course, there are other stores that sell rugs like these. But I had my heart set on this particular one from the Dollar Tree. So if you also like it, I would say try going to multiple Dollar Trees, because when I finally found them, there were a ton of them. They were just sort of hidden in the back of the store. So I'm going to use 4 of these to cover the outside of the ottoman, and there is going to be extra, which we're going to use on the top. Now, these don't know what kind of fabric they're made from, but I did iron them on the cotton setting because they do have a little fold down the middle. I also took off all the tags, so I marked each one with a safety pin so I knew which was the right side of the rug, because I think there is a subtle difference between the right and wrong side, but I had trouble picking it out by eye, and I could be just making that up. There could be no difference, but so I marked them with a safety pin. Now what I'm going to do first is sew them 2 together, right sides together, and just sew them at the edge. And so I'm going to do that for 2 sets of 2. Now, the way I'm going to sew them is I'm going to go, say, I don't know, 6 warp threads in from the fringe. I'm not sure exactly. But one of the reasons I think these are so wonderful for this project is they are easy to sew because they've got lines on them where the warp threads and the weft threads are. So I'm just sewing straight down a warp thread, and I found that really easy. There are other reasons I love them for this project. They're nice and thick, like upholstery fabric, maybe even thicker than most upholstery fabric, and they're stretchy. So if you don't get the sewing perfect, they can stretch a little bit, so they're pretty forgiving. Plus, I love the way they look. So I sewed down, like I said, about 6 maybe warp threads from the fringe, and then I sewed again closer to the fringe. And I cut between where I had sewn. So I've got this bit of fringe. Now I did sew those 2 pieces together. You could sew them separately, but I've got this piece of fringe left over, which I'm not going to use this part for this project, but I'm sure I will find a use for it in the future. And I did that for 2 of the rugs. And then I did the best I could to sew that seam, to press that seam open, because this fabric is quite thick. Now, with those both sewn, I got my ottoman, and I did do this right side out. Maybe it's better to do it inside out, because ultimately we're going to have to sew it inside out, but I was afraid I wouldn't do a good job if I tried to do this inside out. So I put them on opposite corners of the ottoman, and because this is cardboard, we can pin right into it. I pinned them around the ottoman, and that allowed me to figure out where to put the seams for the other corners, because these are longer than they need to be. So I just marked where those other seams are going to go. I also put a safety pin on one side of my ottoman and a matching safety pin on the rug that I have there, because the ottoman isn't square. So this way I would know which side goes where when I put this back. So then I took my rugs and I turned them inside out. And again, I just figured out which warp thread I was going to sew down on each rug, and I marked them there, pinned them there, and just sewed down that warp thread. Now I've got pieces that are longer. So I'm not going to sew them together like I did with the fringe. I'm going to sew another hem on each of those pieces and cut this between those two hems. We are going to use those extra pieces of fabric for the top, so I don't want them unraveling before I can do that. And then I pressed these seams open and put this over my ottoman, and it's nice and stretchy. It fits quite well. Now I picked that 14-inch length so that this could extend below the bottom of the ottoman just a tiny bit, but it doesn't have to if you didn't put feet on your ottoman. And then you can fold the top edge over that last bit of cardboard that's showing at the top of the ottoman. So I did that, and I glued it in place all the way around. So I did the sides first, and then I did the best I could to get those corners to lie as flat as possible. I believe I also put a staple in on each side. Now that the entire ottoman is complete, we need to make the top. So I measured the top, and it's not symmetrical. It's 17 inches by 17.5 inches, measured on the inside. I took some extra fabric and held it against a side when I measured because the fabric will be folded over the top. So I wanted to make sure that I was accounting for that, but it didn't make a lot of difference. It's not that thick. So I cut one piece of cardboard 17 by 17.5, and I put that on the top of the ottoman. But I found that in one or two corners, the fabric was thick enough that the square right angle corners of the top were over the fabric. So what I ended up doing was cutting a 1/2 inch triangle out of each corner. So now what I'm going to do is reinforce this top piece of cardboard. So I'm going to make the top out of 4 pieces of cardboard, and we need to be careful cutting these because we need the grain to run in opposite directions, and it's not a square. So I need to make sure that I have 2 running vertically that are 17 by 17.5 and 2 running horizontally that are 17 by 17.5. And once I had those pieces, I glued them together in the usual way, wood glue and hot glue, and put some heavy books on top so that that could dry. Now, once that's all dry, we're going to upholster that. So for the inside of that, I am going to use the drop cloth again. So I cut a piece that would fit on the inside and fold up to the outside, and ironed that, and then just glued that. I absolutely need that to, at a minimum, go over the edges. And what I ended up doing was just cutting it at the edges. So that's ready for the upholstery on top. Now for the top upholstery, I didn't want to use the same rug that I used around the sides because I felt like it would be too much of that pattern. I have this other rug, which is these stripes of light blue and dark blue, and I just love it. It's the same, I guess, line of Dollar Tree rugs and similar colors. So I ironed that, and it's not wide enough because they're either 15.5 or 16 inches, and I need, at the narrowest, 17 inches plus something to fold over the edges. So what I'm going to do is cut this in half and take some of the fabric that's left over from upholstering the sides and put it down the middle. So to cut this in half, I don't have any like chalk or anything for marking fabric, so what I used was masking tape, and I just ran some pieces of masking tape on either side of the middle. So as before, I'm going to run 2 hems and cut down the middle of the hems, and this is so this doesn't unravel before I'm able to sew the other pieces on. So I did that. I don't know if I mentioned that I'm using a heavy-duty thread for all of this sewing. I have some heavy-duty thread in black, and so that's what I'm using. I think that it's fine. I don't think the color is noticeable at all. Now for the middle, what I have is the ends of pieces, which are 16 inches, not 24 inches, so I'm going to need to piece them together. So what I'm going to do is try to do that symmetrically. So I'm going to take one piece, and that's going to be in the middle. And then for the other piece, I'm going to use its ends and just match up the stripes so that it's symmetrical. So I'm first going to sew the end of one piece onto my middle piece and cut that. And then I'm going to sew the other end onto the other end of the middle piece and cut that. And now we're getting a lot of seams on this top piece. So I'm really going to work to iron those seams open and nice and flat. And then I'm going to take this piece and sew it right sides together to one side of the blue stripe piece, and then right sides together to the other side of the blue stripe piece. And once I've done that, I'll cut all the fringe off and the little knots in the fringe once that I have that seam sewn. And then again, work really hard to press that. It needs to be flatter. It's not going to be large enough. Plus, we don't want bumps in the top of our ottoman. Now with that all sewn together, I am just going to glue and staple that to the top of the ottoman. And I didn't want to cut the fringe. I don't know why. You should probably cut the fringe and sew a hem on it. I didn't do that. I just let the fringe be on the inside. And I folded over the edges along the sides and glued them, and folded over the ends and glued them. But I don't have this on video, but it was a little too bulky in the corners. So I did end up trimming down the corners and sort of sealing those seams with hot glue. So here's the final ottoman. I'm pretty excited about it, but I would really love to know your thoughts, especially what you might have done differently. Please tell me in the comments. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.